Yes, you read the title correctly, and no, it's not clickbait. I created and designed almost everything in this. The elevator pitch of what I'm planning to do in this video is a review of the RP3 Plus with a ton of behind-the-scenes info sprinkled throughout. This is a video that I've wanted to make for a very long time because the truth is there are things that I want to do that are more difficult when this information is not public. This device is factory sealed right now, and I'm planning on opening it up on camera as part of this review, but there are still a few things that I need to mention before we get started. The first thing that I have to say is I never set out to be as involved in the creation of this device as I did, and it's not something that happened overnight. This thing was in development for 2 years, and through that entire time, there were plenty of opportunities to shape it in a variety of ways based on feedback. I've since gone on to create a lot of products in a lot of different product categories, but this one was the first that I can say that I did. And it's the one that I had the most hopes for. I learned a lot from the development of this device, definitely way more than I ever would have known just reviewing products. It has made me appreciate smaller details in other products because I know how difficult it is to do a lot of stuff right when you want to do them right. Before we can open up the box, we need to talk about the design. When you look at all the Retroid Pocket products together, I think you can clearly see that there was a fundamental change that happened between the RP2 and the RP3. The RP1 existed before Retroid Pocket, and the RP2 was just a redesigned RP1 that was pretty much already set in stone before I ever learned about it. The design has grown on me over the years, but at that time, I thought the company would have been better off just canning it and starting over again. Around the time of the RP1 release, I was kind of getting tired reviewing the same weak handhelds that couldn't really do all that much, didn't look that good, and did not provide a great price versus performance ratio. You had companies that would turn out new devices every few months with only minor changes, and from a reviewer standpoint, it felt really stale, and they didn't feel that great to review. They also weren't that interesting. In February 2020, I came up with an idea that there should be a $99 gaming handheld that outperformed everything on the market under that price point or slightly above it. That was the original idea that I tried to pitch to companies that I knew, and it was the original idea that the RP3 was based on. What you have to know about product design is sometimes companies will outsource design work to companies that specialize in design. You also have to know that the same company designed all three of these handhelds, and they're not a good design company for these kinds of products. I didn't know that they would be picked for the RP3 since they did a pretty shit job on the other two products. Before they started doing work, I came up with a design document with a wish list of physical features and colors that I wanted them to try and include in what they made. The idea being that as long as some combination of things inside that guide were used, the end result would be something decent. Needless to say, they did not follow anything in that guide at all. The result was a bunch of cursed RP3 designs. While I could probably show all of the original designs that they came up with on their own, I'm not going to out of respect for Retroid. They paid for the design work, and it would be wrong to just give it out freely in this video, even if no one would want to use it. I can share my original feedback based on what they did. The company came up with 3 designs, and they gave each one of them a name. With these designs, they made some renders, and they put some of the products that they used to inspire their designs inside a big document. After I read their document, I said, and I quote, "I think all 3 of them are the worst designs that I've ever seen in my life. No gaming device should ever look like those designs." Retroid really wanted to pick one of the 3 designs to go forward, and they asked me which one I liked the most, but there was no hope for any of them. At that time, I said that A and B looked like they were portable TVs from the 90s, and I thought that C was absolute garbage that would not be comfortable to hold at all. Retroid ended up abandoning all 3 designs, and they told the company to go back to the drawing board with the original design document that I made. 5 days later, the company came up with 2 more designs. One of them was trash that looked like it was made by AI, but the other looked like an early version of the RP3. It looked a little goofy, but at least it could be refined. They went on to make another set of improvements based on more feedback that I gave, and I asked to see what the device would look like in a Super Nintendo color scheme since that's a device that I really like from my childhood, and they came up with this. It's hard to really appreciate this as much as I did at that time since you've not seen the original cursed RP3 designs, but this looked amazing. It still looks amazing. Few products have looked better than this in almost 2 years. So that covers a lot of the backstory in terms of design, and it helps to explain how a company that made these 2 devices was able to make the jump to this one. Now it's time to finally open up this box. Again, I've never used an RP3 Plus, and I haven't really used an RP3 since I made that old video. I don't know any of the software improvements that they've made, I haven't watched any reviews on this, and I haven't evaluated any of the hardware components that they're now using. I'm flying blind, and I don't know what I'm going to find. Alright, so let's open up the box. So just really quickly, I want to mention that I bought this device with my own money. The company didn't know that it was going to me, so this should be a realistic representation of what an end user gets when they get this product. For the price that I paid, which is on screen now, I got an HDMI cable, a carrying case, and the device itself. There's a cool story about how this box was made. There was an old t-shirt competition that Retroid did during the RP2 release, and one of the designs that was made was this one. From what I know, it never ended up getting used for a t-shirt except for the one person that made this, but it got repurposed for this box because I really liked the artwork and I told them that they should try to find a better use for it. It has a lot of really cool retro elements to it, and I think it fits the brand very well. This is something that companies have started to do in their product packaging, but I think the RP3 and the RP3 Plus look the best. So let's open up the box. And here we have my RP3 Plus. For this video, I ended up going with the clear blue Retroid Pocket 3 Plus, and I did that because it's a color that I don't own. The original design document that I made in 2022 had a few different designs for clear shell variants, and the original RP3 was supposed to come in a clear shell case like this one. That didn't end up working out because there were a lot of imperfections in the mold that this was made with, but this is what it would have looked like. A fun fact about that original design document is a lot of those colors ended up making their way into the RP2 and the RP2 Plus, which, as you probably don't know, was in development during the time that the RP3 was starting to be developed. When this thing was brand new, a lot of people were coming up with suggestions for different color schemes that they wanted to see, and the Funtastic series was my suggestion. I really like how some of these came out, and I'm hoping that this new one can live up to my expectations. I know this isn't going to come across clearly on camera because I'm watching this on a monitor right now, but this is not the color that it actually looks like in real life. It's actually a lot greener than this. That's not really a big deal, but I was hoping that this would be closer to the RP2 that is in this color scheme. So yeah, there's a lot to talk about here because I never did a review on the original RP3, as you guys know. So I want to start off by talking about some of the basic things, and I can also talk about some of the design decisions that were made in this device. The first thing that I want to talk about are the D-pad and the face buttons. These are obviously modeled after the Vita D-pad and face buttons, and that was done for a good reason. What you have to know is the RP3 was conceived during the RP1 time period, and if you remember that, you know that the RP1 did not have a great D-pad. The super retro handheld that became the RP1 had this circular D-pad that was kind of crap, and that ended up changing over to this one. If we look at the history of the company's products, I would say that they really didn't have a good D-pad until the RP2 Plus. So I thought it would be a safe bet for them to go with a Vita D-pad since it would be harder for them to do that wrong. As long as they could mirror what the Vita D-pad felt like, then it should be able to provide a good experience. The ABXY buttons were also modeled after the Vita, and while they probably could be just a tad bigger than this, the idea was that this device would be awesome for anybody that wanted to DIY their handheld. By modeling the device after a Vita, anybody that bought the RP3 would be able to buy aftermarket Vita buttons and do mods on their device to make it look how they want. You can see in this early RP3 prototype that I went ahead and replaced all of the face buttons with Vita buttons. The next thing that I want to talk about are the analog sticks. These are actually kind of interesting. As you saw in the original render, this device was supposed to use the exact same analog top that's used in the Switch. The underlying part is the same, like under this rubber top, the component is exactly the same, but this rubber top is a little smaller than it is on a Switch. You can really notice the difference if I put both of these side by side. Now I'm basing this off of all the time that I've spent with the original RP3, but I don't have any issues with these analog sticks. The choice to go with this smaller cap is one that's actually kind of strange, and I'm not really sure how it ended up happening. What you have to know is around the time that this was made, there were no analog sticks that you could buy aftermarket for a product like this that had L3 or R3 functionality. The only thing that you could really find on the market were these aftermarket Vita sticks, and these do not have any clicking functionality. There are a few ways that you can get around this, and I think GPD was the one that came up with the best solution for this. They ended up putting a tack switch on the bottom of their analog stick, and if you press the stick down, it would press that switch. Amernic also did something similar to this before a part became available that had clicking functionality. When I first used an RP3 prototype that had this analog rubber top, I thought it was kind of strange that it was so different from the Switch part, but I thought that that was just how the part was made. 2 years later, I ended up finding out that the company actually customized this part to be that small, and I do not know why that happened. It's going to be a little hard for you to notice, but the original model for this was supposed to use the same analog sticks that are used in the Switch, the only difference being that they were slightly recessed into the shell. So yeah, not a big deal. I've never had any issues with this part. The underlying part that's in here is the exact same component that is used in every gaming handheld. There is no functional difference between any of them except for the top cap. And the top cap is not enough to make me not like these. They now have another version of this that has Hall sensors, but Hall sensors in a stick like this don't really make that big of an improvement. Hall sensors are good in some sticks, but they don't really make that big of a difference in these small ones. The next thing that I want to talk about are the shoulder buttons. At the time that this thing was designed, stacked shoulder buttons were really rare. They're actually still very rare. For some reason, companies still do the inline shoulder buttons, and I know why they do it. They do it because the molds are cheaper to make them, but they're not better gaming devices. These things were kind of inspired by the Switch, and the only real criticism that I have of them is that I wish this shape was a bit different. I never really liked this high shelf here. Let's move on over to the back. As you can see, this thing does have ventilation holes, and that was done for a very good reason. I think at one point there was a consideration that this thing might have a very small fan inside, but even without the fan, this was done to help cool off the original RP3, which was having overheating issues when it was in development. Having these 3 holes ended up making the situation a lot better in terms of cooling the inside of the device, and it also helped with the overall feel of the device in your hand. A big thing that I'm noticing since I opened this up from the box is this thing has a kind of rough texture to it that I didn't feel in the original RP3. To be honest, I'm not really a big fan of this. I like the original feel of the RP3 better than this, but I also don't know if the other colors of the RP3 Plus have that original texture. If I had to guess, they probably did this to hide the imperfections in the shell that were there on the earlier version that I showed you. Okay, so we're now at the point where we need to turn this device on to talk about it further, but there's one final thing that I want to mention before we do so, because it's pretty obvious to me. This device is branded as a Retroid Pocket 3 on the screen, and I don't know if that's just because they got too lazy to customize it for this model, or if this is a leftover screen from the Retroid Pocket 3. Now, from the screens that I've used on the Retroid Pocket 3, there were 2, and one of them wasn't that great, so I'm hoping that this one is not that screen. For those of you guys that don't know, this thing uses an iPhone SE screen, and that was done for 2 reasons. First is that it was the best 16:9 panel on the market for this form factor and size, and the second one is that it's a screen that's very easy to get on the aftermarket since Apple sold so many devices with this panel. The main benefit by going with this screen is that Retroid would be able to get a very good selection of screens to choose from in their handhelds. Now, there's one interesting downside to this panel that makes it not a great choice to use in some Android handhelds, and my recollection is that ended up causing this to be delayed by about 2 or 3 months. Unfortunately, I can't share what that issue was since the company spent a lot of time and energy to address it, but I thought that that would be an interesting tidbit of information for this video. But that's enough waffling on. Let's boot up the device to get a better look at what we're working with. So as I can see, the boot screen is branded with RP3 Plus, which is kind of why it's a little strange that the screen is marked as a 3, but again, that is what it is. So that boot screen is a little interesting, to say the least. I did a short video on this last year, but starting with the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus, the company started to do custom boot screens that had a nostalgic vibe to them. The RP2 Plus is modeled after the Game Boy Advance screen. I think it looks pretty nice on this handheld. The boot time is a little high, but it is a nice little touch to this device. The RP3 used a boot screen from a Super Nintendo game, and it again carried forward with that nostalgic vibe. The audio is a little loud there and it does lag a bit from time to time, but it still is a cool touch. This boot screen just seems super generic and it doesn't really have any nostalgic vibes to it at all. So as you can see when this device boots up, this is in Chinese. That's because I bought this in the Chinese market, so everything is going to be Chinese by default. But you can see something cool in the background right here, and this is the first time that I've ever seen this in person. Since this handheld was largely inspired by a PlayStation handheld, the background is an XMB theme that is on loop, but it's made to be a bit retro with these blocks. This is an idea that I came up with on my own RP3, and I made a sample version of what you see here, but it couldn't work because the system didn't support it. I've never seen what this looks like like in person, and while I do like it, it does look pretty cool, it does lag a bit as it gets to the end of the loop. There are a few things that I'm noticing that are pretty strange about this device. The first is the fact that this thing didn't have a film on the front at all, and I don't know if all Retroid Pocket 3 Pluses don't have that, but pretty common to see a film that you would peel off. The next thing that's kind of strange is I booted up into a device that didn't have a new user welcome screen at all. Like, this thing already had a bunch of apps installed, and that's not how it worked on the RP3, so I'm going to check to see if this is a device that was already used and was just returned. So the first thing we're going to do is just change the brightness, and then I'm going to go into the language settings and change this to English. I just want to check if there are any files on here from a previous user, but there don't seem to be. It could just be possible that they entirely changed the new user experience, but I'm going to go into the handheld settings and see if there's a way to reset this back to that. I'm just going to re-enter the setup wizard real quick. Okay, so here we are in the new user wizard. I didn't do a factory reset because it doesn't look like this device was ever used before, but I'm also not sure why it skipped over this. This is supposed to be the first thing that anybody ever sees when they get to the device. So yeah, the main idea for this Android system was that it was supposed to do a lot of things for you to make it easier to use. There was a belief around the time that the RP2 released that Android handhelds were like not worth using because they're too difficult to configure, and it was suggested to just go with Linux handhelds because they handle a lot of stuff for you. I knew at that time that we would get to a point where Android handhelds outpaced their Linux counterparts just because there are way more chips available with a lot more power that don't run Linux. So you get into a situation where you need to create a system that makes it easier for people that are new to Android and are new to gaming handhelds, and this is the thing that I kind of came up with. So right off the bat, you can do a couple of things that are pretty cool with this. You can choose to enable or disable Google services. So if you don't like to run G apps or anything like that, you're not forced to do so. You can disable it right here in the settings. Another idea that I came up with was the idea to have a selection of pre-installed apps that you could choose from. I don't really like products that ship with a bunch of bloat that you'll never end up using. And I also don't like the approach that other companies use where they just pre-install a bunch of junk apps and emulators that you would never want to use. This UI here gives you the ability to select the apps and emulators that you want to use. Now, the thing that's kind of strange that I'm seeing here is the fact that removing this checkmark is supposed to uninstall the app, but that doesn't seem to be happening. I don't know how new a lot of the versions of these apps and emulators are, so I'm going to have to replace them when we do the performance section of this video. But that is basically the idea behind this menu. This is another cool thing to talk about. The RP launcher that's here is another thing that I came up with to make it a bit easier to use devices like these. Before the company transitioned their older product into the RP1, they only had one system that you could use for this. It was a closed Android system that didn't give you a lot of functionality. You basically just had an arcade UI and you couldn't really do all that much. When they came out with the RP1, they gave you the choice of being able to dual boot both systems or just run the arcade system itself. Personally, I was never a fan of the arcade system because it really relies on you shipping the device with ROMs, and I'm not really a fan of that in other products, but their system was a lot harder to use than other Linux systems that do the same thing. When they came out with the RP2, they reluctantly ditched that old Pandora system and only shipped a stock Android experience. But a lot of people wanted the system to be easier to use, especially for emulation, and there were not a lot of great options available at that time. Right around the time that the RP2 released, I came up with a front-end system that I thought would be able to provide some of the functionality that you got on a Linux system on Android, with the main benefit being that it would be easy to use. Now, the interesting thing about this is there was kind of a disagreement over whether or not to do that, because there were a lot of people at Retroid that really felt strongly about the old Pandora system, and they didn't want to design something that was open for Android. Right before the 2 Plus released, there were a lot of people that knew the shortcomings of this system because it didn't have anything that made the device easy to use for people that don't have any experience. Now, I personally don't need something like this because I can pop into any emulator myself without any issues, but I knew that something like this would be better than nothing for the RP2 Plus, and the company reluctantly decided to go forward with the design that I originally made for the 3 on the 2 Plus. Some of the UI elements changed around, but the basic idea is here. The design in the 2 Plus never really got to 100% of what it was supposed to have based on my original design, but I still like what they were able to do. The reality is, before the 2 Plus, there were no other systems like this on other Android handhelds that made the devices easier to use, and even after all this time, there is still nothing that comes close to the experience that you can get on the 2 Plus, the 3, or hopefully the 3 Plus. Changed. Let's go back to the device now. There's one thing that I want to talk about now that I didn't have time to talk about before because I didn't actually use these buttons to make the video to this point, but I am noticing that there's something strange going on with these input buttons that I didn't know about. As I already mentioned, The RP3 was designed to use a Vita D-pad and Vita buttons, and the feeling was also supposed to be the same. My suggestion about going this route had nothing to do with any thoughts that the Vita buttons are the best in the world. In fact, I don't think that they are. I thought the company had a far greater chance of being able to imitate the style of a Vita than they did trying to do a conductive rubber set of buttons. And that largely ended up being the case. I think the buttons in the RP3 that I have here feel kind of similar to how they are on a Vita. If you like those kind of buttons, then this is a great device for you. Once a lot of people started getting their hands on the RP2, there was a lot of feedback from people that bought it that didn't like the clicky nature of those buttons. And at that time, there weren't many handhelds on the market that used clicky buttons. The majority of them used conductive rubber. But Retroid didn't have any experience making conductive rubber handhelds. When they started working on the RP2 Plus, they switched over to conductive rubber, and I think they did a decent job on this. It's definitely a lot better than the original RP2 was. A lot of people like these buttons, and after reading a lot of the feedback from people, I suggested that Retroid should make a set of conductive rubber buttons for the Retroid Pocket 3. The main idea was, if you like the Vita and you like their buttons, then you'll know exactly what you're going to expect when you get this handheld. Nothing would be a surprise. But if you know deep down that you are not going to enjoy the Vita buttons because you've used it before, I didn't want this awesome device to not be in consideration. Unfortunately, even though they had a year notice with that feedback, they never really started doing any R&D on conductive rubber buttons. The main goal would be, if you know that you want a conductive rubber set of buttons, you'd be able to buy that version. Now, all of you guys know that's not what ended up happening. They shipped the dome switch version, and if you wanted to switch it over, you needed to open it up and do that mod yourself because the company didn't want to do that work. I also have to point out a few things about those buttons. Because they were started so late, there wasn't really a whole lot of time to make improvements, and the company wasn't really willing to go forward with improvements to get them to be better than what they are. I think the ABXY buttons got to around 90% of their potential, and they probably could have gotten to 100% with more refinement. The D-pad, on the other hand, never really got to its full potential. This thing is probably about 60 or 70% as good as it probably could have been with more refinement. The problem is the company just ran out of time. They really wanted to sell the RP3, and they weren't interested in doing more improvements on it, so this is as good as it got. In its current state, it really is a bit too stiff to be a better option over the original D-pad. Again, I haven't followed any of the development of this device, and I didn't really follow any on the RP3. This one is using both sets of buttons at the same time. This is not something that we haven't seen before because the Udon device uses this, but I don't think that this was the best option for this handheld. The dome D-pad feels identical to the one on the RP3, but the face buttons feel a bit different than they do on my RP3 unit that has conductive rubber. I don't know how well this is going to come across on camera, but these ones make a bit more noise than my original one does. I'll just try to simulate that right now. Even if I press this very fast, it doesn't make that much noise. But this one does. This is my RP3 that I used to prototype these buttons. And this is my RP3 Plus. Probably not enough to really knock this, but I just wanted to point that out because it's something that I'm noticing right now. I want to talk about the screen now, and I probably could do a full panel measurement on this just to get a lot of statistics, but I think I have a better way to evaluate this screen. I mentioned in my video on the RP3 that there would be a Russian roulette system with the screens, and these are the two screens that would have been used in the RP3. There's a few differences between them, and neither of them is really better than the other in any particular way. The top device is using the original RP3 screen. This is the one that was used when this was still in the R&D phase. This thing is pretty decent, but it has a very strong blue tint to it that cannot be overcome through software. This is the screen that was supposed to replace that original one, and it does do some stuff better than that original screen. The first is that it has better color temperature. This is a bit warmer than that one, but the screen itself is also a lot brighter than the old screen was. I haven't adjusted my camera at all, and you can see the one on the bottom at 100% brightness is a lot brighter than the top one. But it has one big negative that I think eclipses all of the things that it does better than the original screen. It has a really bad response time. Based on my panel measurements of the time when I got this sample, this thing has about 2 to 3 frames of ghosting that you can see really easily on this home screen here. If I just swipe these back and forth, you can see there is a ton of ghosting. Now, I could slow this down and you could count the frames if you wanted to, but I think it's pretty obvious that this does have a lot of ghosting. Being able to see this kind of ghosting is really going to depend on the kind of games that you're playing, but it is there, and it is why I never thought this panel was a good panel. On the flip side of this, we have the original screen, and while this one does still have ghosting, it doesn't have nearly as much as the top screen does. As you can see, this thing does have ghosting, but it's not that bad. If I do both of them together, it should be really obvious to you that the one on the top is worse. Just to kind of make this apples to apples, I have all of these devices on the exact same contrast setting, and all of them are at 100% brightness. In terms of color temperature, none of these are really the same, but this top one is closer to the naked eye to this top screen right here. So I'm going to remove the blue screen from this example so we can just look at these two. Just as a refresher, this is how things look on the original screen that a lot of people got in the RP3. And here's how it looks on this screen that seems to have the same color temperature, but it seems to have a much lower response time. So that's something that I'm really happy to see. This company has had a lot of issues sourcing screens, so this one I think is decent enough, even though it is not as bright as this older one. But let's just compare it to the original screen because this one did have a low response time. That original one's probably a little better than this, but again, it's very close. In terms of picture quality, I think the RP3 Plus screen is in the middle of these other two. It's not quite as high as the screen with a really high response rate and a brighter panel, but it is definitely better than the original one. I think you can see what I'm talking about for the saturation when you look at this background texture here. It's definitely a lot more saturated on this panel. There's one final thing that I want to do before we start taking a look at the performance of this guy. I want to do a test of the audio quality. For this, we're going to compare this against a couple of different devices. The first device that I'm going to use is the RP2 Plus, since that's the last product from this company that I did a review on. And I'm also going to compare this against the 3 since it's the last device that I tested. On the higher end, we're going to compare this against the Udon Pro, since that's one of the better sounding devices that are out there right now. So without any further ado, let's start with the RP2 Plus. And now the RP3. And here's the RP3 Plus. And finally, the Udon Pro. You can feel free to share which one of these you thought sounded better in the comments below, but I am going to give you my general impressions. I tested all of these devices with a lot more music off camera, and I have to say that the 3 Plus is a bit worse in audio quality than the 3. I don't know if there's something different internally because I haven't opened this up yet, but I'm noticing on the high end that there is a bit of distortion in some of the songs that I was listening to that don't distort on the 3. Both of them have the same max volume, so it's kind of noticeable when one is distorting and the other isn't. But what I can say is this device sounds a lot better than the RP2 Plus did. It's not as good as the Udon Pro is, but it's still pretty decent. Now we're at the point where we can finally start focusing on performance, and for this I'm going to focus on things that don't run that well on the RP3. Just be aware that this system is going to have no problem with a lot of the retro systems that I'm going to be skipping over. We will start with some Android games, and I'm not expecting that much of a difference when it comes to normal native Android games, since a lot of these can scale down to the RP3 with lower resolution settings. But I do think we will see some improvement when we go to some high-end ports that are available on Android.
But we had a system crash about 20 minutes ago, and I'm still trying to find my files. Just one of those days, I guess. They were having some problems down in the
Welcome to City 17. You have chosen or been chosen.
Here we go. Hold it there. We got it. Dad.
Alex, where are you? Oh, please, God, tell me you're out of the city.
Well, not quite yet.
What?
But listen, Dad, we found him.
Well, we should keep moving. I'm sure the Combine haven't forgotten about us. I heard Vortigaunt's a few minutes ago.
Now we'll switch over to emulation, and I'm going to start with N64 because that's a system that never really shined on the RP3 because it couldn't really take advantage of the 16:9 screen. For this, I'm going to use Mupen 64 Plus with the resolution set to 720p to fill out the screen.
We're entering Corneria City now. This is horrible. I'm clear, but my monster's down.
Similar to N64, Dreamcast is another system that doesn't really uniformly shine on the RP3 when we use widescreen hacks and increased rendering resolution. This device seems to handle it a lot better.
Taki を渡しな。どうするつもりだ。てめえには関係ねえよ。そうはいくか。
When it comes to PSP, the T310 was already decent at handling most of the library, but upscaling is hit or miss. Interesting tidbit, the T310 was originally selected for its decent PSP performance. At that time, that was the pinnacle of what that processor could do. On the RP3 Plus, we can scale to 3x resolution for most games, or 2x for more demanding ones. Vita Emulation is new to Android, and it seems to perform well on the RP3 Plus with some better supported titles. This one came as kind of a surprise. Here we are with 3DS Emulation using the latest build of the official Citra emulator. This thing added support for Vulkan, and it holds up very well on this device. I have these games rendered at 1x resolution, but a lot of them can go higher without issue. Now we move on to GameCube. The RP3 and the RP2 Plus could already play a lot of games if you used the special version of Dolphin that came with the device, but that required the use of sub 1x resolutions to run a lot of games. For these tests, I've kept things at 1x native resolution, and while we do have some graphical issues, the performance is decent and we can even go up to 2x for some titles.
Holly and Phoenix Feather.
Wii Emulation is similar to GameCube, and you can get a lot of games to run on this hardware if you're willing to poke around and find which version of the Dolphin emulator works best for the game that you're playing. PS2 Emulation is a system that shows a night and day difference compared to the RP3. With the sub 1x resolution support that was added to the emulator, a lot of games were playable on the RP3, but this hardware handles things a lot better with the additional A75 core. We can play a lot of PS2 games at 2x native resolution, and we always have the option of scaling down if we need. Finally, we have Switch Emulation. This emulator improves every day, and it seems reasonable that we should expect better performance on this hardware in the future.
Oh man, it's a gas fella, forced out from underground. Kid pops in the gun, forced drilled in.
Now let's move on to my pros and cons. There were a couple of good things that I found during this video that made it on my list of pros. The first one is the screen. This screen is a lot better than the two screens that were used in the RP3. It's bright, and the response rate isn't that bad. The next pro for me are the speakers. The speakers in the model that I have are not tuned as well as they are in the Retroid Pocket 3 units that I have, but they are a lot better than the ones in the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus. The next pro for me is the performance. The performance on this is decent, but there are some areas where the gap between it and the Retroid Pocket 3 is not as big as you'd expect given how big of a jump the RP2 Plus was compared to the RP2. That being said, there are some retro systems that run a lot better in widescreen than they do on the RP3. The final pro for me is the battery life. This thing has pretty good battery life across a lot of emulators, but it could be a bit better with some changes in their software. For cons, I have a lot more than I expected before I started this video. I thought that I would only have one. The first con for me is an issue that I originally found in the RP3, and I'm shocked to still find it here. Actually, the reason why I can find it here is part of a bigger problem that this company has. A bit of backstory, right before one of the original launch windows for the RP3, I found that the screen flickered uncontrollably when it was under 10% brightness. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this was a central part of my why I didn't review the RP3 video. Well, that issue is in this device. Since this was such a huge issue on the RP3, there's really no reason why this should ever exist in any product that they make. Capturing this on camera is super difficult, but it's not difficult to see by the naked eye when I have the brightness set to minimum. This is something that I didn't even think to check on until someone left a comment on my community post about this issue. The second con for me is the current software. I found a ton of bugs while I was filming the performance section of this video, and while no device is perfect, I even found another issue that I had originally brought up right before the RP3 went on sale. As you probably know, that device does not have a lot of RAM, and there was an issue with Wi-Fi that got worse whenever there was not enough available RAM on hand. One of the engineers created a system that will monitor the available RAM, and whenever it gets to a critical level, it will just start killing everything and anything. Now this is going to start with some small stuff, but then it starts doing surgery with a sledgehammer and will eventually even kill the game that you're playing. This happened to me all the time when I was testing early builds of the RP3, and the only way to stop this from happening was to use a whitelist feature. That feature never worked on the RP3 software that I was given, and no matter what I did, they wouldn't take note of this issue. I just want to give you an example of what this looks like in action. Here's Let's Go Pikachu again, and you'll notice that the game will crash as I leave the house. You might think this is just an issue with the emulator, but it's actually that sledgehammer at work. Now, if I asked you to tell me how many resource-intensive emulators are out there, how many could you find? Maybe 5? How hard would it be to just take those into account so your memory-freeing program never tries to attack them? It's just lazy that it's like this. There's no logic. Once we whitelist Skyline, the game will no longer magically crash as we leave the house. What the hell? Now, my original script for this said once I whitelisted Skyline, then the game didn't crash anymore, and then I was giving the advice to everybody to add all of their apps here, but the game is still crashing. And I'm gonna go check the logs right now to see if it's still being killed by this application. So yeah, this is going a little off script right now. I actually checked on this issue a lot after just filming that last clip that you just watched, and I was able to confirm, even though the application is whitelisted, it will still kill this application. And the funny thing for me is I was originally testing Skyline on the RP3 with this problem, and the exact same thing is playing out right now. It's really strange because I tested this a lot off camera when I was doing the performance section, and I was able to verify that putting it on the whitelist did actually stop it from killing it, but now it's killing it every time, and I have all of the logs to show it's happening. There are just way too many other dumb bugs in this software that I don't really feel like going into in this video. The third con for me is the stock performance. This device is underperforming by a significant amount in some areas due to some really strange configurations that were used. I know how to fix this on my own device, but it's not something that an average user is going to know how to do, and I don't know why you'd want to artificially limit your hardware in a gaming device. The fourth and final con for me is the price. I bought this thing for $160, which is a little over the amount that this goes for overseas, but this hardware is not worth that much, and for the record, I never thought the RP3 was worth $120. That's not to say that this processor couldn't be worth that much in another form factor, so flip fans don't at me, but it's not worth $150 or $160 in this form factor. Add $50 to this, and you're at an Odin Lite that has like 2 to 3x the performance of this with 4G by by the way, 4G that could have been added to the RP3 Plus to make it a better product. That thing has faster storage, better buttons, better Wi-Fi, and a higher resolution screen with higher resolution HDMI. It's a no-brainer. Now, the RP3 Plus was not in my consideration when I envisioned the $99 RP3, and while the RP3 didn't launch at $99 like it was supposed to, it did end up selling for that much during Black Friday. The single most important component in this device compared to the RP3 is the processor, and that thing is only a few dollars more than the T310. Obviously, the RAM is also important, and realistically, we don't have enough for what this processor can do, so you need to add some cost for that, but you're not at $50 over the $99 Black Friday pricing on the RP3. I was gonna say that Retroid is shifting over to Anbernic pricing, but even the RG505 is cheaper than this for the same hardware. I never in my wildest dreams thought that Anbernic would have better pricing than Retroid. Retroid is supposed to be the people's brand. Good prices for good hardware and software. It was supposed to be the exact opposite of Anbernic, and the whole reason why I helped make this device was to finally provide competition to the market, but I'm not seeing it. I really feel like this company has lost what made it special to begin with. I have some closing remarks that I want to say before I wrap up this video. If you bought an RP3 or an RP3 Plus, I never made any money from that, and I want to make that perfectly clear. At the end of the day, I just wanted something that I thought people would enjoy. I didn't know that the RP3 Plus would release so soon after the RP3, and for the record, I do think that it kind of sucks for anyone that bought the original model. I came up with the entire idea of the Plus version, and I advocated for PCB upgrades because I didn't want people that bought the RP2 to feel like shit for having a significantly weaker product when a new version was available for only a little more money. I know it's kind of fashionable to warn people about buying products from this company after the RP3 Plus launch because now everyone is worried that a Plus version is just around the corner for everything, but I also think it's funny that the same people never warn you about stuff like this for other companies. When have Powkitty, Anbernic, or any other company for that matter offered you a way to reuse something that you already have from them? They don't. Anbernic is the biggest offender of releasing products with only minor changes at full sticker cost. If you own one of these and you've had fun with it, then I'm glad. I put a lot of effort into this device. This video could have easily been 5 hours long if I went through everything that happened over 2 years of this being in development. There were many times that I wanted to pull out all of my hair, but there were also fun moments too. Taki out.
Look at me. Taki?
Yeah, but it works.
Broom broom.